What was happening on Earth long before its surface began to rumble under the heavy footsteps of dinosaurs? Imagine a planet that is familiar, but at the same time eerily alien. Moonlight fell on restless oceans full of strange life forms. Land masses rose and fell under the onslaught of enormous geological forces. The atmosphere smelled of sulfur and acid, and the creatures that ruled here were unlike anything we would meet in the wilderness today. It was a time when life was still looking for its firm place, first in the sea and only much later on land. It was hundreds of millions of years when the world was forming, when diversity was born out of nothingness, which prepared the ground for what was yet to come. This era, although almost forgotten today, is the key to understanding not only the origin of dinosaurs themselves, but also the entire history of life on Earth. We will go deep into the times when there were no mammals, birds, or reptiles, when the oceans were teeming with strange invertebrates and the continents were barren and silent. We will discover a world that is even more mysterious and less explored than the time of the dinosaurs. What happened on Earth before them? Who ruled here? What was life like without vertebrates, flowers, and the sounds of birds? Get ready to travel deep into the prehistoric fog. The birth of life is one of the greatest secrets that planet Earth hides. It is estimated that the first life forms appeared approximately 4 billion years ago. It was nothing that would be remarkable at first glance. Rather microscopic single-celled organisms that slowly multiplied in hot primeval oceans or around hydrothermal vents deep below sea level. These early life forms, called prokaryotes, had no nucleus or complex organelles, but they were the ones that laid the foundation for all subsequent evolution. For over 1 billion years, they were the only inhabitants of the planet, but thanks to the photosynthesis of some of them, such as cyanobacteria, a fundamental change has occurred: the release of oxygen into the atmosphere. This gas was deadly to most organisms of the time, but it also allowed new, more resilient life forms to emerge. And it is here that the story of more complex cells and later multicellular organisms begins, culminating in a rich life that reaches its peak hundreds of millions of years later. The Ediacaran period is one of the most mysterious periods in the history of life. It lasted from about 600 million to 540 million years before the present. It was at this time that the first signs of more complex multicellular organisms appeared in the form of flat, soft bodies, which today we know only from fossil imprints in fine deposits. These creatures, often without sensory organs and without a hard skeleton, resembled jellyfish, feathers, or leaves. Scientists are still arguing whether it belongs to the family tree of today's animals or whether it was a completely separate, now extinct branch of life. These organisms inhabited shallow seas, where they fed at a slow pace by filtering microscopic particles from the bottom or column of water. They had no eyes or mouths, just special structures that allowed them to survive in a very low oxygen environment. Although their existence seems simple at first glance, they were pioneers who paved the way for the next evolutionary step: the sudden and surprisingly dramatic outburst of life at the beginning of the Cambrian. The Cambrian explosion is a fascinating phenomenon in which life developed incredibly rapidly. Within a few tens of millions of years, most of the basic body plans that we know today appeared. This evolution took place approximately 540 million years ago. Suddenly, creatures with exoskeletons, teeth, eyes, and complex limbs appear in the oceans. From the soft, almost shapeless creatures, arthropods, protozoa with defensive structures, predators, and prey arose. The causes of this explosion are still being researched. It was probably caused by a combination of factors: an increase in oxygen levels, the development of genes that enable the creation of complex bodies, but also ecological competition and an evolutionary arms race. The Cambrian explosion is not only an event that saw the spread of species diversity, but also the first major conflict between hunters and their prey. It is at this time that the first real predators, such as Anomalocaris, emerge, and the first real struggle for survival begins. In the hundreds of millions of years of Paleozoic era, the oceans were home to countless fascinating creatures, many of which have no modern precedents. Trilobites, with their characteristic three-lobed body, were one of the most successful and widespread. They inhabited the seabed, where they fed on dead matter or smaller organisms, and some species even had complex eyes with lenses made of calcite. In addition to trilobites, Cephalopods with straight shells also spread in the Paleozoic seas, which could reach several meters in length and became the first true marine predators. Later, armored fish also appeared in the Devonian, such as the dreaded Dunkleosteus with its massive jaws and bony shell. These fish dominated marine ecosystems, and their weapons inspired the future evolution of predators. Life below the surface was varied and dramatic, and it was here that the first real battles for survival took place. At the same time, the Paleozoic seas were a laboratory of evolution, where new forms were constantly created, adapted to different environments and ways of life. The transition of life from water to land was one of the most fundamental moments of the entire evolution. Although the first traces of life are known mainly from the seas, already during the Silurian and especially the Devonian period, about 400 million years ago, some life forms dared to leave the aquatic environment and penetrate the land. The first conquerors of land were probably simple plants similar to today's bryophytes, which were able to survive in a humid environment on the banks of rivers and lakes. Vascular plants with a simple conduction system have also gradually developed, which allowed them to grow tall and spread to drier areas. Animals soon followed. Initially, it was arthropods, for example, millipedes, spiders, or scorpions, which probably followed their prey, tiny invertebrates. It was only later that the first vertebrates, transitional forms between fish and amphibians, appeared on land. These ancestors of future frogs and salamanders had to solve completely new problems: movement on solid ground, breathing air, loss of moisture. And this is where the fascinating chapter of the adaptation that changed the face of life on Earth forever begins. Over time, more complex plant structures that resembled forests that appeared on land. It happened during the Devonian, about 380 million years ago. However, these forests did not look like today's. There were no flowers, leaves, or grass. The trees of that time were made up of ferns, horsetails, and club mosses, which grew up to several tens of meters high. Their trunks were often covered with coarse scales, and their reproduction depended on the humidity of the environment. They propagated using spores, not seeds. These first forests were of fundamental ecological importance. Thanks to them, massive carbon dioxide binding and oxygen release began to occur, which fundamentally affected the planet's atmosphere. In addition, plant roots began to erode rocks and contributed to soil formation. As forests spread, they created new ecosystems and refuges for more and more terrestrial organisms. These were quiet but vibrant landscapes in which a new stage of life was slowly being born: the vertebrate kingdom on land. Long before the first dinosaurs roamed the landscape, the land was ruled by other creatures, often less known but no less fascinating. Among the most prominent are Paleozoic amphibians, such as Ichthyostega or Acanthostega, which still maintain strong ties to the aquatic environment. They were equipped with limbs, but their bodies revealed fish origins. For example, they had gills or fin-like tail fins. In the Carboniferous period, the first truly terrestrial vertebrates appeared on the scene, including early reptiles that were already independent of water for reproduction. Various arthropods also dominated next to them, especially giant millipedes and insect representatives such as Meganeura, a huge dragonfly with a wingspan of over 70 centimeters. Thanks to the high level of oxygen in the atmosphere, arthropods of that time could grow to sizes that would be unthinkable today. These terrestrial ecosystems were varied and vibrant, though full of creatures that today look like creatures from a nightmare. It was an era of trial, error, and surprising solutions. A period when life on land was learning to breathe, walk, and survive. The Permian, the last period of the Paleozoic, was a time of dramatic changes. At that time, one huge supercontinent, Pangaea, was formed, which united almost all the land masses into one whole. This continent was surrounded by a single huge ocean, and its interior was dry, arid, and extremely hot. In these challenging conditions, reptiles thrived, which were less dependent on water than amphibians. The first synapsid reptiles, the ancestors of today's mammals, developed, such as Dimetrodon, with its characteristic dorsal sail, which it apparently used to regulate body temperature. However, at the end of the Permian, the greatest catastrophe in the history of life occurred: a mass extinction that destroyed approximately 90% of all marine species and about 70% of terrestrial species. This could have been caused by large-scale volcanic eruptions, climate change, acid rain, and disruption of the global carbon cycle. This event wiped out a whole host of ecological groups and made room for a new equilibrium to emerge. And it is from this void that a group of reptiles will later emerge that will one day dominate the world: the dinosaurs. When the chaos of the Permian extinction ceased, the Earth remained almost empty. It was a planet of silence, death, and desolate nature. Marine ecosystems were devastated, coral reefs disappeared, and many of the former dominant groups, including trilobites, never reappeared. On land, the surviving reptiles had to cope with an extremely dry and hot climate. The soils were arid, the plants sparse, and the animals lived at their limits. Even so, nature began to slowly wake up again. Some groups survived in refuges and gradually began to spread to the newly emerging ecosystems. During this period, the first representatives of the groups develop, which prepare the ground for a new chapter of life. Early archosaurs, relatives of future crocodiles and dinosaurs, began to appear on land. These periods were full of evolutionary experiments. Some lines led to dead ends, others laid the foundations for the huge diversity set that explodes during the Triassic. However, the recovery from the disaster was not quick. It took tens of millions of years for the planet to become a place teeming with life again. It was a slow return, but it was thanks to him that the domination of the dinosaurs could be born. Approximately 240 million years ago, during the Middle Triassic period, lineages began to form among reptiles that would soon bring a major evolutionary novelty: dinosaurs. These first ancestors were neither huge nor particularly dominant. They were rather small, agile creatures moving on their hind limbs. These included, for example, logopetids or silosaurids, animals that moved quickly and had a body structure reminiscent of future dinosaurs. Their main advantage was the ability to move quickly and an efficient breathing style that allowed them to survive in a challenging environment. These first forms gradually evolved into real dinosaurs, which will soon spread to all corners of the world at that time. But at this early stage, they were still just one of many players in the diverse ecosystem of the Triassic world. Other evolutionary branches of reptiles lived alongside them. For example, early crocodile-like archosaurs, or special marine reptiles that will soon go to the oceans. It was a time of unrest, experimentation, and sudden changes. And while the dinosaurs still had a long rise to come, their journey had just begun. The Triassic was indeed a special epoch. After the Permian catastrophe, the planet remained biologically poor for a long time, but gradually began to fill up with life again. The climate was mostly dry and variable, with extensive semi-deserts, sparse vegetation, and periods of extreme heat. The plants that dominated the ecosystems of the time were mainly ferns, cycads, and conifers. Grasses and flowers did not yet exist. The animal world consisted mainly of various species of reptiles, from the fish-eating ones to the first herbivores with heavy bodies. Archosaurs developed on land, among which the first representatives of the groups that would one day lead to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and pterosaurs gradually emerged. In the sea, ichthyosaurs and nodosaurs appear, elegant reptiles adapted to swimming, which have dominated the aquatic world. Insects and small vertebrates completed this colorful picture. Triassic ecosystems were dynamic, full of conflicts, adaptations, and constant competition for resources. These were ecosystems in which the evolutionary competition reigned, and dinosaurs began to win in it. The reason was completely different: geological, climatic, and biological conditions. There was no disjointed landmass as we know it today. Instead, a single supercontinent, Pangaea, dominated, causing extreme seasonal temperature fluctuations. The interior was hot, dry, and without precipitation, while the edges of the continent had wetter conditions. The atmosphere contained more carbon dioxide, which increased the greenhouse effect, and the seas had a different chemical composition than today. These factors created a world in which completely different creatures lived, and in which life had to adapt to completely different challenges. In addition, there were no modern ecosystems, no meadows, flowers, birds, or mammals. Evolution was still trying to find stable patterns for survival. Therefore, strange combinations of properties arose during this period. For example, reptiles with gills, trees without leaves, or insects the size of birds. The country was not just different then, it was almost foreign. And it is this otherness that is the reason why the time before the dinosaurs is so fascinating and mysterious. It was a world that laid the foundation for all that was yet to come. The movements of the Earth's plates shaped the planet long before any dinosaurs appeared. At the beginning of the Paleozoic era, there were several smaller continental blocks, but over time they began to merge. The culmination of this process was the formation of the supercontinent Pangaea at the end of the Carboniferous and during the Permian. This huge continent connected most of the then continent into a single entity that stretched from pole to pole. The result was not only a vast interior exposed to drought, but also dramatic changes in ocean currents and climate. This united continent has had a major impact on the development of life. Due to the minimal geographical barrier, animals could spread over a large area, which led to competition, but also to diversity. Later, when Pangaea began to break up again, space was opened for the isolation of species, which had a direct impact on the development of dinosaurs in different parts of the world. The movements of the continents were thus the key not only to changes in the landscape, but also to the evolution of life itself. Earth's atmosphere in the pre-dinosaur era was markedly different from today's. In the earliest periods, oxygen was almost completely lacking. It was only with the spread of cyanobacteria and photosynthesis that oxygen gradually began to penetrate the atmosphere, leading to the so-called oxygen catastrophe, the first major ecological change on the planet. In the Carboniferous period, when the first forests grew, the oxygen concentration reached its peak, allowing giant arthropods to exist. However, in the Permian and Triassic period, the climate gradually warmed, the atmosphere dried out, and oxygen decreased. These climate changes shaped the environment in which animals had to survive. High temperatures, lack of precipitation, and frequent temperature fluctuations led to the disappearance of many groups and opened up space for the emergence of new ones. Reptiles in particular began to spread quickly due to their ability to tolerate extreme conditions. The atmosphere and climate were not just a backdrop, but the main drivers of evolution. Without dramatic climate change, the world would have looked very different before the dinosaurs, and perhaps never happened. Yes, and very interesting ones. Although the world before dinosaurs often seems slow and calm, the reality was different. Predators have dominated the seas since the Cambrian. The first of these were, for example, Anomalocarididae, predatory arthropods that fed on trilobites and other invertebrates. Later, in the Devonian, their role was taken over by giant armored predators such as Dunkleosteus, capable of shattering a bony shell in a single bite. During the Permian, the first true reptiles predators appeared on land, such as the Gorgonopsid, a massive creature with long canines, resembling saber-toothed cats. These birds of prey were not only physically formidable, but often very adaptable. They hunted quickly, efficiently, and put pressure on the development of their prey's defense mechanisms, strong bony shells, escapes, or camouflage. The ecosystems were thus in a constant balance between attack and defense. Although these predators are not known to the general public today, in the time before the dinosaurs, they were the real rulers of land and sea. Perhaps the biggest mystery remains the origin of the complexity. How is it possible that simple single-celled organisms have produced such an incredible variety of shapes, sizes, and behaviors? The Cambrian explosion, for example, still has no clear explanation. Why did it happen so suddenly? And why then? Likewise, the sudden and complete extinction of some groups, such as trilobites, or the dramatic climate changes that have taken place over several millennia, remain a mystery. In addition to them, the first coral reef builders of the new generation also appeared in the Triassic seas, because the original species did not survive the Permian. Life in the sea was relatively poor compared to before the extinction, but it was dynamic. Development went forward quickly. New adaptations, new body shapes, new hunting strategies. The seas were full of fish, bivalves, cephalopods, and marine reptiles, which competed with each other for food and territory. And it was here that the evolutionary force was born, which also affected life on land. Food chains began to function at full capacity again. The Earth before the dinosaurs was a place of incredible transformation. Life arose from nothing, overcame unimaginable catastrophes, and yet continued to develop. Strange creatures swam in the seas, the first reptiles ruled the land, and the atmosphere changed with the landscape. Did you like this video? Like, subscribe, and help me bring more expeditions into the deep past. The comment will also please. Thanks a lot.